There is such a thing as true recreation, but there is also something that we might call false recreation. We'd like to discuss these aspects of recreation as they pertain to health, both mental and emotional health, and during the next half an hour we will be discussing some things about that, and we hope you will join us.
The following program presents principles designed to promote good health and is not intended to take the place of personalized professional care. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the speaker. Viewers are encouraged to draw their own conclusions about the information presented. Welcome to Help Yourself to Health with Dr. Agatha Thrash of Uchee Pines Institute. And now, here's your host, Dr. Thrash.
True recreation has the connotation of restoration, whereas entertainment has just the connotation of fun, maybe excitement, maybe injury. Whatever it is in your mind, let us make a study of some of the principles of true recreation as we might find them in the Bible. And I would like to present to you from Matthew 13, verse 44, something that I can recommend to you as always being a feature of true recreation. It is something that we can joy in with our Heavenly Father, knowing that He is the author of all true recreation. Let me just read. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that a man discovered hidden in a field. In his excitement, he hid it again and sold everything he owned to get enough money to buy the field and to get the treasure too. Now this describes the enjoyment that this man had. The Bible says, this version of the Bible says that he actually had excitement about the fact that he had found the treasure. Now if we can get that same kind of excitement about things having to do with spirituality, this can bring to us true recreation. But there are things having to do with the things that God has created that make it so that we can have true recreation from that too. Have you ever considered the recreation that Adam and Eve might have had in the Garden of Eden? Picture a bit, if you can, Adam and Eve. In the Garden of Eden, they did not have to work for a living. Everything that they needed, their clothing was provided for them. They carried it around with them in the form of a covering of light, a robe of white, pure white light. The canopy of the earth made by the firmament that enclosed the entire earth and made the temperature uniform throughout and made it just so that it had exactly the right humidity, exactly the right temperature, to be comfortable and healthful. That was all provided for them in the atmosphere around them. Then their food was provided for them by the trees and the shrubs of the garden, so that they had their food already for them just to pick and peel and eat. Grains that they took, I suppose they would probably just rub the shuck off, and I'm sure that it was much different than it is now. But for them, that was recreation too, gathering the wonderful things that God had provided for them in the Bible. Down through the centuries, things changed. In fact, for Adam and Eve, it changed right away. Once they introduced sin into the garden, then the whole aspect of recreation changed. After that, they had to work for a living. By the sweat of their brow, they earned their bread. And now they didn't have the protective covering that they had had. They now had to make their clothes as well. So this made a certain amount of drudgery in what they had to do. But even so, I'm sure it was far, far different than it was after the flood. After the flood, then the earth was swept clean of much of the beautiful verdure that covered the earth prior to the flood. And now the ravished earth was no longer the beauty that it had been before. Now Adam and Eve had a different a whole different way of looking at recreation, and especially Noah and his sons had a very different attitude than Adam and Eve did in the very beginning of time. Now we come on down through history and we get to the time of the Greeks. The Greeks had athletic type sports, which they enjoyed very much, and a large percentage of the people actually engaged in the sports. Then we come on down to the Romans, and fewer percentage of the people engaged in the sports. Most of them became spectator sports. Then we come on down to through the centuries to our day, and now we have become largely couch potatoes. We like some board games and some parlor games and some computer games, but we don't like the games that Adam and Eve had in the beginning, or that this man in chapter 13, verse 44 of Matthew had, where for joy he went and sold all that he had so that he could enter into that great experience. He felt that this recreational experience with the Lord was worth everything to him. And we can have that very same experience too. We can have true recreation. But there are some things having to do with sports, which many people think of as true recreation, which are not the very best for us. And I have here Don Miller, who is my associate at UC Pines. He is in the education department there. Don Miller is a health educator and a health counselor, and he will talk with you some now about sports. What do you have here?
Well, I'm going to tell you about a study that was done down in Texas a number of years ago about what do sports do to people. You know, I was very much involved in sports through high school and college and in the military. And I just remember what it did to me to go up against the other team. You had this thing in you. And there are certain theories about what sports do for a person, but what I want to do is show you a study on the screen that was done in Texas with high school varsity sports players, 1,600 of them. That's a big study. And this is what they found after seeing how these boys reacted. They found that they had increased aggression. I don't think we need any more increased aggression in our society. Increased irritability. That's inbred into the sports person. Reduced honesty. It's amazing. You watch these pro sportsmen out there, and you can see that they weren't across the line. You can see that they didn't touch somebody or they did touch somebody, but they just they complain loudly because they've been called for their violation. Reduced honesty. Decreased self-control. Decreased independence. They're more dependent upon other people. And then there's that last one, number 6, a slight increase in self-esteem. Now, I'm always amazed that we send our children to esteem classes. We sit there and say, well, their problem is their esteem is too low. But the Bible says we are to esteem others better than ourselves. And I think many times we misdiagnose or we mislabel what we consider might be esteem in these people involved in sports, and it's more of an arrogance. You can see it in pro sports. The football player goes across the finish line or the goal line with his football, and he stands there and he wiggles his legs and he does all kinds of jiggles and jaggles around there. Looks like a foolish person doing these things, all pride. The basketball players nowadays, they go out there and they snuff the ball and they hang on the loop like a chimpanzee. It's all show. It's all a part of their arrogance in their thing. As a matter of fact, for my thoughts, going to watching a sports program, you go to the arena or the field or whatever, you're watching a bunch of millionaires run around and play a game. There's better ways to spend our monies nowadays, and so I think we need to take our children away. And I'll be talking about a few things later on, soccer moms, about sports that really aren't the best thing for our children. There are better things that they can be doing, but that's what the Texas study showed, Dr. Thrash, that it really doesn't do any favors for young people.
Yes, as I looked at that list that you have there, I thought those aren't things that we used to think of as sportsmanship, where we thought of honesty, honor, fair dealing, trying to help the under person to do better. And when I was in school, I remember those were the things that were considered to be sportsmanship. Concerning children in sports, there are now teams of all sorts for children, and we would think that children would be much more altruistic and idealistic. But let me just read some of the things that we find that some of these children's teams foster in the children. First, a study which was published in the Journal of Sports Psychology in 1981 showed that quarreling occurred on a regular basis. The children would quarrel with each other. Furthermore, they would quarrel with the coach or the umpire. And it wasn't at all uncommon for them to quarrel with the parents of some other player. Fist fights would break out. Fist fights that were a fight to the death. They tried really to do each other in. It wasn't just to hurt them a little, but to really injure them. Crying was another common complaint on several occasions, and it was generally in the context of some perceived injustice done to themselves or some failure that they had done. They might leave the playing field or the court crying because they perceived that they had failed and they had really hoped or had their ideals pinned on doing well, and they did not do so well. Rivalry with other children was greatly increased, and altruism was greatly decreased. Now, these are all antisocial expressions. These are expressions which, if they are fostered and cherished by the child, will lead to a handicap in later life. So we want to watch over our children. Sports are fine, but the sports that are not competitive sports and that foster these kinds of antisocial expressions that can handicap the life forever. Now, not only can the general life be handicapped and the social expressions be handicapped, but also the body can be handicapped. And Don Miller is going to talk with you about some of the problems that people get in who are in competitive sports.
Okay. Every sport has its equipment, and of course we've always got the balls. Every sport has a ball involved just about in its particular sport, but there are pieces of sporting equipment that we don't really think about too often. We really don't want to think about it. One piece of sporting equipment that becomes very handy is the ace bandage. I have used these things a lot of times when I have been engaged in sports. Also, ankle braces and ankle supports because we hurt ourselves so much. Matter of fact, every year there are 10 million sports injuries in this country alone. We have knee supports and leg braces, and quite often we've got the crutches. I had to use one of these after breaking a leg in a sporting event. These are standard equipment in sports nowadays, and we have to be very careful with our bodies. I know of a couple of situations. One, a friend of mine, an older man, was involved in just a pickup game of basketball, just something as simple as playing a game of basketball, bouncing around, but you know, it got a little bit rough. They were going to play little street rules, jungle rules, as we used to call it, and through all this thing, he caught a finger in his eye, and now he is permanently blind in that eye just from a simple game of basketball. Once when I was stationed in Key West, Florida, I was an officer there at the Marine Barracks, and we were playing a softball game, and our coach, who was also a player, he was running to third base, and the ball was coming in, and he just dove head first, and hands went out first, and it just took his thumb straight back, and it was just dangling up against his arm. And he stayed in the game because he loved the game, but he really did a miserable job on his hand. I remember years ago, I was stationed in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was going to play racquetball one noontime with our director, a colonel. And we get out there, and he was very good, and I wasn't good at all. And he'd sit there and be hitting that ball, and every once in a while I'd turn around and look at him, and he'd say, "Don't turn around." And he'd be playing some more, and I'd look back, and he'd say, "Don't turn around." Well, he realized I was turning around too much, so every once in a while he'd take that ball, and he was very good. He would plant that thing right in the middle of my back, and it hurt terribly. But I realized what he was doing. If I ever turned around while he hit that ball and I had caught that ball in my eye, I would have lost my eye. And they lose their eyes all the time in sports nowadays. As a matter of fact, you'll see many times, especially in racquetball and handball, they now almost standard equipment is special eye protection. So if you're going to be involved in these sports, protect your bodies. Now, we've already talked about the fact that it's going to be hard to protect your character because your character will suffer trauma. But protect your body too. We see the football players, they've got their shoulder pads and everything seems to be padded, but they're broken down men many times. Their playing span is very short from their injuries. And that goes right back to the earliest times into their sporting experiences. Right now, if I were to go outside and pick up a rock and throw it at a tree or somewhere pretty hard, I would be hurting for about a week because I've got a permanent rotator cuff injury because the first day of softball season, every year in the military, I'd get out there and I'd throw that ball as hard as I could because it's the first day and you feel great, and I permanently injured my rotator cuff in my right arm. It's a thing that I'm stuck with. I have basically done a job on my knees because for years I was a competitive runner. And it's not a bad thing to run. Running's a good sport, but when you really get into running, this is what you do. You're running in a race. And I'm talking about a distance run, and you're always trying to beat that person up ahead of you. And you beat that person, and then there's another person. And you're putting your body through stresses it's really not made to take. And I basically slowly wore down my left knee until the point where I really don't want to run anymore because I don't want to be stuck with osteoarthritis as I get older. And so we need to learn to take care of ourselves. The bruises, the strains, the sprains are part and parcel with sports injuries, but there are greater injuries that people succumb to. We see them broken necks and broken bones and broken backs. I wonder, is it really worth all the pain and the debility that we experience through these sports? And so I'd rather get involved in a type of a sport like walking in the woods and working in my garden and doing things that with myself and with my Lord, they're not competitive and they're pretty safe for my body. I feel a whole lot better with sports like that, Dr. Thrash.
Yes, those are very acceptable sports. Another type of recreation that many people engage in that we would find unacceptable is that of drinking and drugs. Recreational drugs and recreational alcohol can be very ruinous, not only to the health but to the entire life. And many people sacrifice their lives and all their potential on these altars, the altar of alcohol and the altar of drugs. We recommend to you that you totally avoid them, that they be left entirely to the animals that we do experiments on, and not use them at all in your recreational habits. I have a number of studies done on blood alcohol levels in individuals and the disabilities that they have at various levels. I have also been a witness against individuals who have had high blood alcohol levels and have committed some crime. And so I recommend to you that you not consider anything that has the great potential that alcohol does and drugs of ruining your life forever. I recommend that you simply leave that alone. It isn't worth the altered, perverted sense of fun that some people have when they use these substances. It is not worth that to risk all of your future. Now, another part of recreation is something that has both a blessing and a curse, and that is music. I have just read a book by Dr. Eurydice Osterman, who is the head of music at the Department of Music at Oakwood College. Dr. Osterman has written a book called What God Says About Music, and I have enjoyed reading that. And as I read it, I thought about the large place that music has in the earth made new. I'm sure that God will teach us all sorts of things, like how to play a harp. Apparently we will have that as innate knowledge. We will not have to be taught. We will be simply issued the harp, and immediately we will be able to play. What a joy that will be, a very challenging instrument. But we will also sing. The human voice is the most beautiful musical instrument on earth, and singing can be a great blessing to us. But there is that about music that can also be a curse, and Dr. Osterman talks about that in her book on music, about how the physical body is affected by the kind of music that we listen to. Much of this kind of music we will find in the mass media today, in radio and in television, and we recommend to you that you learn that kind of music that can be damaging to your psychological makeup and to your physical body, and that you avoid that kind of music. With television, there are also some other dangers that we should mention. One is that the flicker of television requires a certain time span because of the fact that the eye has to unite those flickers into one steady image, and making that flicker synthesis requires a certain amount of time. Then when you receive the image into the eye, after that flicker synthesis is done, then it must be passed to the back of the head, where we have the visual cortex, way back here in the back of the head. That doesn't take long, but it does take a split second. And then not only must we receive it there in the visual cortex, but then we must transfer it to another area, which is an interpretation area, another split second. Then we have to transfer it to yet another area where we synthesize all of these aspects of what has gone on in the brain, so that we can send the composite picture to the judgment center of the brain. In the judgment center, we criticize what we have seen. Now, television does not give us enough time to criticize what we have seen. All of these steps take a little bit of time. Once we get to the judgment center, then it isn't possible for us to take the time with commercial TV to evaluate what we see in commercial TV. Now, you will observe that 3ABN broadcasts its programs in an altogether different way. The flicker is the same. All the things that happen in the brain are the same, except for what happens in the judgment center. You're given plenty of time to make a judgment about what I have said or others have said, so that you can see if that is moral or immoral, if it agrees with your religion or it does not agree, if it's offensive to your sensibilities or it's not offensive. All of that takes time. Commercial TV does not give you that time. I consider that to be a very difficult problem with commercial TV, and one of the reasons why parents should be extremely careful with television. So far as I'm concerned, a child does not need to see television. They can watch 3ABN. It's not commercial TV, and they will be much edified by watching 3ABN. Now, there are some aspects of television that Don Miller will talk with you about, and perhaps at this time he will say a few words about that.
I'd like to say a few words about that because things have changed since I was a child. I was born in 1947. 1950s was the year of the television came out, and things were on television back then, which I consider even today to be rather innocent. I mean, I grew up with Beaver Cleaver. I grew up with Ozzie and Harriet. I grew up with these very simple family situations. But things have changed. There's been a whole paradigm shift, as it were, to today's television programming. And I don't watch television anymore. I do not have a TV. I have not had TV for years, but I hear about what's going on these TVs. I read in newspapers. I read about that guy named Beavis and his friend. I read about Married with Children, and all these things. The very programming is meant to change a person's whole mindset. Even going back to the detectives and the dramas back in my youth, where you had the things like Highway Patrol and programs like that. You never saw blood and guts flying. You never saw the violence that you see nowadays in programs on the television. And so I've even forgotten the name of the programs back then. That's good. Things are getting better in my mind. But we see that as programming changes. Well, they've done some studies. They've gone to places where they have never had television, and finally they've gotten TV in. And as soon as TV is introduced to a society, they find a number of things. One, homicides go up, delinquency goes up, attitudes of children in schools down as low as the first and second grades go down. In South Africa, for years, the homicide rate had been falling, and then TV was introduced. And as soon as TV was introduced, for the next 15 years, it went up precipitously. Now, it's interesting to look at the time in which TV was introduced in South Africa and how much it rose, and take the same period of time for TV introduced into the United States, and the rise in crime was much lower in the United States. Why was it lower in the U.S. than it was in South Africa? Are they different? Were they created by a different God? No, because when TV was created or introduced into the United States back in the 50s, the programming was quite innocent and family-oriented. But when TV was introduced in 1975 in South Africa, programming at that time had become quite violent, quite perverted, if I can use that word. And it changed the people, because what you view, what you behold, is what you become. And so if you want to become a Beavis, watch Beavis. If you want to become like Christ, observe Him. Observe Him in the Word. Observe Him in nature. And because one of these days, we're going to be like Him if we allow Him to make us that way, Dr. Thrash.
Mm-hmm. I feel that even what we might call innocent TV, as a Christian parent, we need to be very mindful of the fact that most innocent TV and innocent drama teaches our children that they can get along very well without God. And I'm not certain that that's the message that we want to transmit to them. Now, one big time when we need to have Christian recreation is on Sabbath. And singing, walks in nature, water walks or water nature studies, all of these can be a part of what we do on Sabbath that can teach our children about the wonders of God's creation. And as we see the wonders of God's creation, we come to have a heart filled with gratitude for Him. We know that God created this world, then He made Adam and Eve, and He gave this world to them as a wedding gift. It's a gift that is so varied, so big, that we can spend an entire lifetime trying to study the various aspects of it, and we still never exhaust the marvelous source.